Give that.
Welcome back to our GTS Pharmacy Point of Sale System training. This is lesson 1.2. In this particular lesson, we are looking at how we log in and then log out of the system. Now, in the previous lesson, I indicated that we have different users for this particular system and their specific role that they have access to. That is the functions or features of the system that they are able to access. And so in this particular lesson, that's what we are going to look at. And so we look at the different users and the kind of permissions they have. And so it's important because at the end of the day, you have the cashier, you have the pharmacy, you have the pharmacy technician, you have the pharmacist, yes, pharmacy technician, and then the administrator. All of them playing different roles and having different access to the system. So the first thing that I will do is to test our login. Now, if somebody doesn't have access to the password or the right password, when they log in, it will tell them that username or password is wrong, okay? And so this means they don't have access. But then if they have access, so let's first log into the admin. So the admin, you log in, you are presented with this particular interface and it have access to everything that we talk about in lesson 1. So the admin actually have access to everything, including the ability to add new employees to the system, okay, and then the configurations of the entire system. And so mostly the people that have admin role are trusted people by the pharmacy owner or the pharmacy owner him or herself. And so that is how it works. And so the pharmacy administrator have access to the transfer, the receiving, the sales, the attributes, the employees, the finance, which is the tax, the expenses category, the settings or the configurations, and then equally have access to the item case, the gifts, the customers and the suppliers, and then the expenses, cash app, and reports, and then the ability to send SMS. Now, let's log into the cashier interface and see something. You see, one of the things that you have to understand is that in as much as these user roles have specific roles and then access to the various features, the administrator can specifically give them access to certain areas by default they don't have access to, so that they can work on the system. All right, so if let's log out. So if you want to log out, I'll come back to that. I hope you saw what I did, but then I'll come back to that again. So let's log in as a cashier. So you realize that the cashier interface is quite different. It has access to the dashboard, all right, but then they only have access to the home and then the sales, which they will be selling, and then the customers, because they will equally be adding customers to the system, okay? So they will have access to customers, but realize that they don't even have access to the prescription the customers have, right? They don't have access to the prescriptions. They can't enter prescription. They can only look at the information, and then probably they can edit the basic information of the customer if anything is wrong. But the actual pharmacy features for the patient or the customer, they don't have access to it. So their role is to just use the POS to sell the products that are available, okay? And you realize that in this particular instances, this particular salesperson have access to all the branches. Now, they can be prevented from using all the branches, so they can be restricted to only one branch, okay? And so that's how the system works. And so this is just for training, so I decided to enable some of the features so that we understand. Now, we'll go back and add additional features to the cashier so that you understand how it works. So you see that cashier doesn't have access to the reports and all that. And so that is how the interface looks like. Very simple, straightforward. They can equally add customers and then register sales, as simple as that. But they can add things that have to be added by the pharmacist, like prescriptions and other stuff, okay? So now let's log out and then go back and use the pharmacy. So the pharmacy also have this particular interface. So you realize that the pharmacy have a little bit, they have access to the branch transfer, the receiving, the sales, the items, the customers and suppliers, and the reports, right? But even the report, not all the report that they have access to. So you can actually give them access to certain reports and prevent them from accessing certain reports, which is also fine. So the permission works perfectly. You can give them access to certain information and you can decide not to give them access to certain information. Now let's look at the customer side, okay? So let's say a pharmacy comes to the customer, they are able to add prescription to the customer. They are able to add the customer profile, which is basically about the medical history and about other information that have to do with the customer in terms of the patient's profile, right? And so this is how it is. So the cashier doesn't have access to the things the pharmacists have access to. But if you want, you can give the cashier access. That is if the cashier is also trained in pharmaceutical jobs, and so they can add the role of a pharmacist. So you can either make it a pharmacy, or they can still be a cashier, but you can give them access to certain features that the pharmacist have. Okay, and so that is how the interface looks like. All right, and so this is how it is. So now that's how the logins are. So it depends on the user role that the person is, that determines the feature they see when they log in. Okay, and so this is the user who have access to everything. Right, now let me customize one of the users, and so we see if they get access to the features they didn't previously have access to. So I'm going to do for the cashier. So I go to permission as administrator, and I'm going to give them access to, so let me give them access to only one branch. So let's say the Sunyan branch. Okay, let me do the main branch and remove them from the Sunyan branch, so the branch is restricted. Reports, let's give them access to the sales reports. So under reports, we give them access to sales reports, and then customers reports. Okay, and then with regards to receiving, they can receive now. So when it comes to the sales side, we are limiting them to the main branch, because that is that. So let me see the one I did here. Okay, the one I did here was about items. No, we don't have to give them access to items for now. That's for the cashier. So the cashier, they only sell, and so most of the features you don't have to give them access to that. And so let's also give them access to be able to add expenses, because probably if they are selling and they have to make certain expenditures. Okay, and then let's give them access to the message side. Now let's save it. So this is for the cashier. I've saved it. Let's log out and then go back to the cashier side and see. So the cashier, and so you realize that the features have increased. Now you have the sales, the customers, and then the finance, you have the report and expenses, and then the message that we give. All right, and so they are able to still maintain their role and be able to sell, add customers, open the report for the customer and transaction reports of what they've sold, and then they can sell. All right, and so the system have flexible way you can be able to add more features to a specific user, so that they play that role in addition to their default user. Okay, and so that is how the login system looks like. So depending on the role given, that is what will be presented to the person. Now you go into detail how you add employees and all that, but then this particular lesson is just for logging in, and then how the interface appear depending on the user type. And so this is how it works. I hope you understand. And so this is where we end this particular lesson, and I'll be seeing you in lesson 1.3 in our next video. Thank you.